This is Environmental Record Reviews with Kirk. 24 Code of Federal Regulations Part 58 is the federal regulation that implements for HUD the NEPA requirements, which is the National Environmental Protection Act from the early 1970s, requirements for financial assistance provided by HUD or a grantee of HUD, such as the state of Illinois DCEO. It is extremely difficult to explain to the Speaker of the House and the Senate President and the Governor's office why they would have to appropriate state funds to pay back HUD for funds being returned because a proper environmental record review was not completed prior to the obligation of HUD funding. Under the NEPA assumption authority, responsible entities assume HUD's NEPA responsibilities. In this case, for CDBG grants issued by DCO, that is the unit of general local government, generally, village, city, township, town, or county. They serve as the federal agency on behalf of HUD, and the responsible entity assumes several decision-making authorities. That assumption is assumed by execution of a grant agreement as a HUD subrecipient and or by the certification of the request for release of funds that I'll discuss later. Responsibility cannot be delegated to another organization or individual, and the responsibility is to ensure that mitigations are incorporated into project plans and are actually implemented through completion of the activity, generally through completion of the construction. In almost all federal financial assistance, but specifically for NEPA, for CDBG funds, the responsible federal official is the chief elected official of the CDBG grantee community. The mayor, the village president, the township supervisor, the county board chairman, not an appointed city administrator or village manager, the elected official. They are the ones solely authorized to execute the HUD request for release of funds form. They accept the jurisdiction of the federal courts on behalf of their community, and they have the authority to enter into binding commitment in response to court judgments. Running back to DCO's main mission, environmentally, of not wanting to return funds to HUD for lack of an appropriate and complete environmental review, prior to the environmental approval or clearance, the grantee community may not commit HUD funds, begin the bid process, or commit non-HUD funds where the activity would have an adverse environmental impact and or limit the choice of reasonable alternatives. In other words, please do not take an action with HUD or other funds that will be listed in the grant agreement before environmental clearance. The environmental record review is the NEPA administrative record for each project. It is reviewable by the public, HUD, the state, and courts, and it should contain all evaluations, findings, decisions, documentations, public notices, and approvals. And it is the grantee's only proof of procedural compliance with federal environmental law and its defense against environmental challenges to its actions. Next, I'll provide you with general guidance on determining the level of environmental review for your project under NEPA. The 5 levels of environmental record review in order of increasing complexity for CDBG projects issued by the state of Illinois, DCO, are exempt, categorically excluded, not subject to the laws at section 58.5, categorically excluded, subject to the laws at 58.5, environmental assessment, and environmental impact statement. The latter is extremely rare for Illinois CDBG funded projects. In reverse order, for time consumption, an environmental impact statement generally takes 1 to 2 years to complete and have approved, whereas the exemptions can be completed in less than an hour. For exempt activities for DCO's CDBG projects, The most common uses of an exemption are to cover the cost of environmental and other studies and activity delivery activities, engineering or design costs, and the assistance for temporary or permanent improvements following disaster or imminent threats to public safety, including from physical deterioration. That last one, which is the emergency exemption under what we generally call Box 10, is a project that consists solely of assistance for temporary improvements that do not alter environmental conditions and limited to the protection, repair, restoration activities necessarily only to control or arrest the effects from disasters or imminent threats to public safety, including those from physical deterioration. The DCO, Environmental Review Officer, whether that's me or Kara, must pre-approve use of this type of exemption for construction activities. It is also rare, but generally in each CDBG PI round, there may be one, but I would have to review that ahead of time before saying yes, your construction could be cleared environmentally under emergency exemption box 10. The next level of environmental review up from exemption is categorical exclusion. There are two different types of categorical exclusion. One is not subject to the laws and authorities at 58.35, and the other is subject to the laws and authorities at 58.35, and that is categorically excluded subject to, or CEST. If the level of review is CENST, which is not subject to the laws and authorities at 58.5, generally for CDBG, these are the following types of costs. As you saw in the preceding slide, maintenance could be included in a CEST review, and then the definitions of maintenance are as follows. Cleaning, yard work, repainting, replacing kitchen appliances that are not permanently attached to the building, patching a roof leak, and replacing broken windows. The main difference between an exemption, a category excluded not subject to, and a category exclusion subject to 58.5 is that 58.5 adds 13 additional bodies of federal environmental law on top of the 3 bodies of federal environmental law covered under an exemption or a CENST review. For additional guidance on categorizing an activity as maintenance, please see the following HUD materials. You'll note throughout this environmental review presentation, if we've included something in bold, it means it's more important to focus in on those through just the general common use with PI or housing rehab funds. For now, I'm going to give you the most common uses of a CADEX subject to 58.5 environmental review for CDBG funding. You'll notice on the numbers in parentheses, those are the actual numbers from the NEPA regulations at part 58.5. The first is the acquisition, repair, improvement, or rehab of public buildings and facilities, provided that 1, they are already in place, 2, will be retained for the same use, and 3, any of the work done will not change the size or capacity by more than 20%. Number 2 is the removal of architectural barriers that restrict the mobility and accessibility to the elderly and those with disabilities. This was very common as we've been doing environmental reviews for CDBG revolving loan fund closeouts, where they're doing streetscape improvements or sidewalk improvements that go beyond just replacing a sidewalk in place, but where they're removing architectural barriers. 3I covers DCO's housing rehabilitation program, where it involves single-family housing rehab and unit density is not increased beyond 4 units, and the project does not involve changes in land use from residential to non-residential, and where we're not funding the footprint being expanded in a floodplain or a wetland. 3III relates to non-residential structures. We use this type of review occasionally for our economic development projects under CDBG. And again, you'll notice that the facilities and improvements are in place, will remain in place, will not be changed in size or capacity by more than 20%, and they won't involve changes in land use from one type or another. And box 5 covers combinations of the above activities. This is more common for non-construction related CDBG economic development projects. There are two potential outcomes once you've completed a community's categorically excluded subject to 58.5 review. And the first would be that review converts to exempt, and that would be if on the statutory worksheet with all supporting documentation, you have all no's for all 16 bodies of law, and there are no circumstances requiring compliance or formal mitigation. If that's the case, you document the file and send that in your environmental record review to DCO, and the project may proceed once DCO approves that environmental record review. Generally, a categorically excluded subject to 58.5 review cannot convert to exempt when you've completed the statutory worksheet, including all of its supporting documentation, and you realize one or more of the 16 bodies of federal environmental law requires a formal mitigation or further compliance actions. In that case, it won't convert to exempt, and you have to proceed with the formal approval process, which includes a required publication or posting, followed by a request for release of funds form, followed by turning in the environmental review to DCO, and then DCO, once we approve it, issuing an environmental release letter. Here are some sample CDBG public infrastructure activities that have had environmental reviews in the last 8 years that have been categorically excluded that converted to an exemption. Although this lecture today does not cover the 16 bodies of federal environmental law in great detail, the main question comes up is, if it converts to exempt, would it generally also not require a HUD TDOT tribal consultation? And I tend to follow HUD's guidance to me in my first training in 2013, which is that if you're replacing work in place without any expansions of the soil being disturbed, for already disturbed soil, then no, a tribal consultation would not be required for the typical CADEX converting to exempt reviews. But please feel free to reach out if you have any questions during your environmental review as to whether or not a tribal consultation is required for your proposed construction project. Here are a couple more examples of infrastructure activities that could potentially be CADEX converting to exempt. They're more likely for revolving loan fund closeout fundings or CDBG economic development funding. The main bodies of law that will require a categorical exclusion not converting to exempt would be floodplain management or wetlands management. So when you're documenting floodplains and wetlands, please make sure the following conditions are maintained. And therefore, if no 8-step floodplain or wetland review is required, then then the exemption could convert to exempt in general. Generally, the environmental assessment, or an EA, is the highest level of review a DCO CDBG project will have. And it basically covers any project that's not exempt, category excluded, and does not meet HUD standards for requiring an environmental impact statement. Some CDBG examples are extension of water or sewer lines to an unserved community, or like just even to new customers. If you're extending anything new, that would require an environmental assessment, or a water tower, an additional one, or the replacement of one. Under NEPA, the purpose of the environmental assessment is to evaluate the project of a whole, and it gives the form itself has extra functions and extra compliance boxes, and you will accomplish all of that by researching and filling in those boxes and attaching your supporting documentation, including any floodplain or wetlands 8-step review public comment periods, if that's required by that documentation for your project. For documenting an environmental assessment, you'll not only have the completed environmental assessment form and the documentation for the 16 bodies of federal environmental law, but you will also have your FONSI, NOI, RROF publication or posting. It's proof of publication or posting, and it's proof that the FONSI was disseminated to interested parties we'll discuss later. Once that's been turned in and the state's objection period's up, if all is acceptable to DCO's environmental review officer, we will issue an environmental release letter to the community. Starting with environmental assessments submitted to me on or after February 1st, 2023, their formatting must use the new environmental assessment version issued by HUD containing 20 environmental assessment factors, including the 2 new environmental assessment factors under the new climate and energy section added by HUD in compliance with Presidential Executive Order. The new environmental assessment factors are climate change impacts and energy efficiency. They were added by HUD by Executive Order 14008, Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. The new version of the environmental assessment was announced by HUD's Office of Environment and Energy in April 2022. However, the paper version, meaning the Word and PDF versions, to be used by states grantees, such as CDBG Public Infrastructure and Economic Development grantees of DCO, were not released to the states until late October 2022. The new environmental assessment form is now available on the DCO Office of Community Development Environmental Materials website. Training by HUD for the new environmental assessment factors and all existing environmental assessment factors is available online at the HUD Environmental Assessment Factors e-guide at the site shown on the screen. Reminders: no environmental assessment factor boxes may be left blank or marked NA, which to HUD OEE is not acceptable. Please fully read and research the HUD Environmental Assessment Factors e-guide available on the HUD Exchange. It is the only resource available for documenting and describing the EAFs on your environmental assessment level review form. And all environmental assessments submitted to me on or after February 1st, 2023 must use the new 20 EAF formatting. This also includes any environmental assessments submitted to me for review before that date, but which ultimately have a fatal flaw that requires cancellation, correcting, and republication of the notice for the environmental assessment. Once you've completed the documentation and the filling in of the environmental assessment, you'll have a determination at the end before you as preparer and the chief elected official sign it, and that will either be a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact, which means no environmental impact statement is required, or a FOSSI, a finding of significant impact, which would require an environmental impact statement to be prepared. That is extremely rare for DCO CDBG. Because we're funded by HUD, we follow HUD's guidance on when an environmental impact statement required, and I'll discuss that on the next slide. When you think of HUD, you have to think of what its acronym stands for: Housing and Urban Development. Housing is their first mission. So for HUD's Office of Energy and Environment, the guidance they give out of when one of their funded projects requires an environmental impact statement generally involves if the project is going to increase homes or beds or housing units by 2,500 units or more. None of the projects that DCO OCD has funded in the last 8 years have gone anywhere near that standard. So if you think you should be filling out an environmental impact statement for your CDBG project, get a hold of your HUD environmental review officer immediately, because chances are we're going to tell you no, it's just environmental assessment or a categorical exclusion.